Hey guys, it's Miss Vinson, and today we're going to talk about monopolies. Well, a monopoly market is a market where there is only one seller, and the product that they're selling is unique. So if you know you're the only place that someone can go to get something, then that means that you have control over your price. Monopolies are not price takers. They are totally price makers. Three of the main types of monopolies are government-created monopolies, natural monopolies, and monopolies who just own a key resource. A government-created monopoly is where someone is the only seller of a product by the action of a government. So if the government issues a patent or a copyright on something, that means that you're the only person who can produce this product and profit off of it for a specific amount of time. Well, these are definitely barriers to entry, right? Now, natural monopolies are when it makes sense or it's safer or it's more efficient to have just one provider of something in an area. So with natural monopolies, really you want to be thinking about your power companies, your water companies, your natural gas companies. Man, if we had 5 competing power companies, we'd have 5 sets of power lines above and under the ground, and that would just be a mess. So sometimes it makes sense and it's safer and it's more efficient just to have one provider of something to an area, and that's called a natural monopoly. Finally, the third type of monopoly that can exist is just somebody who owns a key resource. If you own something nobody else has, then that means that you can make and sell something that nobody else can. Case in point, the De Beers Diamond Company is a company that's headquartered in South Africa, and they actually own 90% of the world's diamond mines. That pretty much makes them dominant in that market. Anyway, back to our list of characteristics for a monopoly. We have a single seller of a unique product, and they can set whatever price they want, so they're price makers. Now, what does this mean for our graphs? Well, do you remember when we did perfect competition and we had the market graph and then we had the graph of an individual single seller at that market? We don't even need that graph anymore. If you're a monopolist, then the market graph is your graph. I mean, let's face it, without you selling your product, this market doesn't even exist. So a monopolist demand curve is that market demand curve, which is downward sloping. So here we go. Let's draw our marginal average graph for a monopoly. Now, you know that all firms have cost, so we definitely know that we're going to have our marginal cost and our average cost curves on this graph. Now, the demand curve that corresponds with the monopolist is a downward sloping demand curve. Your demand curve is still your price line, is still your AR. That stuff doesn't equal MR anymore. We're going to have a separate MR curve. To draw your MR curve, it's going to start at the same place on the y-axis as your demand curve, but it's going to be twice as steep. When you have a downward sloping demand curve, you remember you have an elastic zone in the top half, you have a unitary point right in the middle, and the bottom half of that downward sloping demand curve is the inelastic portion. Notice that whenever your demand is at unitary, your marginal revenue is at 0. Price is still equal to AR for a monopoly, and that's true for all firms. But price is not equal to MR anymore. In fact, take a look at your graph. What curve do you find your price from? The demand curve. And where's your MR? Below that. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, how can price be greater than MR? Because isn't marginal revenue the extra revenue you make when you sell something? And if you sell something, aren't you just bringing in the price? Now, it helps to look at some of these numbers in a chart. And in order to sell greater quantities, the monopolist has to lower its price. So notice how if the price is $100, then nobody is buying this product. But whenever they lower the price to $95, there is one person who is buying this product. Well, if this business wants to sell a second unit, they have to lower their price from $95 to $90. Well, they're getting $90 for the second unit, but they could have had $95 for that first unit. So since they had to lower the price on that first unit, they're losing $5. So even though the price is $90, the extra revenue they're bringing in is only $85. Where did that other $5 go? Price is $90 and our marginal revenue is $85. Why is there a $5 difference? That's the $5 that this business is losing because they had to lower their price on that first unit. Well, if this monopoly wants to sell a third unit, then they have to lower their price on all units. So they have to lower the price on the previous 2 units. So I mean, yes, the price is $85, but you know what? They could have gotten $90 for those first 2 units. So when they lower the price to $85, yeah, they sold that third unit. They're missing out on the $5 they could have gotten in the first unit and the $5 they could have gotten on the second unit. So even though the price is $85, notice now they're really only bringing in an extra $75. So price is always greater than marginal revenue because for a monopolist, in order to sell more units of output, they have to keep lowering and lowering their price on all units of output. So now we have our marginal average graph for a monopoly. Since a monopoly can choose their output level and they can choose their price on the y-axis, we have to find profit maximizing output level and their profit maximizing price they want to charge. So we have an extra step here. The reason why we never had to find profit maximizing price for perfect competition is because perfectly competitive firms couldn't control their price anyway. Well, guys, when you're looking for profit maximizing output level, you should know by now you're going to look where MR hits MC and then drop straight down to your quantity axis. That is your Q star. But now we got to figure out what price they want to charge. Well, what curve do you always find your price from? Do you remember? You've always found your price from your demand curve. So what you need to do is you need to start at your Q star and then go all the way up until you run into your demand curve. That is your price line. And then read the value straight off from there. That's your profit maximizing price. All right, so let's read this graph at a quantity of 100, which is our Q star. Now, if we want to find our ATC, we're just going to start at our quantity, go up until we hit our ATC, and we see that that is worth $18. If we're looking for our AVC, just go up until you hit that curve, and we see that that's $12. If we're looking for our average fixed cost, remember that's the gap in between ATC and AVC that keeps getting smaller, so that's going to be $6. Marginal cost is your Nike check, so go up until you hit your Nike check, and you don't have to go up very far right now, and that's just going to be $9. Now let's find our total cost. With total cost, you're just going to multiply your averages times your quantity. So ATC times Q means that your total cost is going to be $1,800. AVC times Q means that your total variable cost is going to be $1,200. And AFC times Q means that your total fixed cost is going to be $600. Now we can also find our profit and revenue terms as well. Remember that price is always found from the demand curve. So go up until you hit the demand curve, and that is going to be $20. So your price and your AR are both $20. Now, if you want to find your marginal revenue, you have a separate MR curve on your graph now, so start at your quantity and go up until you hit your MR, and that's only going to be $9. What about total revenue? Price times quantity. Our price is $20, our quantity is 100, so now our total revenue is $2,000. We're looking for average profit. Your average revenue was 20, same thing as your price. Your average total cost was 18, so that means that your average profit is a positive 2. What about your total profit? Your total revenue was $2,000. Your total cost was $1,800, and so your total profit is going to be a positive $200. Now, what about marginal profit? Your MR is $9, your MC is $9, so your marginal profit is 0. Now, notice that we're making a positive profit. How do we know this? All of the short-run profit situations that you learned about in perfect competition, they are universal for all firms. And even though the demand curve is downward sloping instead of horizontal, you're still looking to see if the demand curve is above ATC for positive profit, skimming up against the ATC for breaking even, in that space between for loss but stay open, or completely below the AVC for loss and shut down. Well, what about the long run? Is the long run universal for all firms too? Unfortunately, no. Remember, the long run in perfect competition, there was only one situation that those firms could be in, and that was coming back to breaking even. There were no barriers to entry in a competitive market. Well, think about a monopoly. How many sellers are in a monopoly? One, they must have some way of keeping other people out of their market. They must have barriers to entry. And they do. Think about the De Beers Diamond Company. They own that key resource. Since they own so much of those diamond mines, that pretty much prevents other people from really becoming dominant in the diamond industry. So monopolies have very strong barriers to entry. Now, for the long run in a monopoly, there are two situations they could be experiencing. They have the chance to earn positive profit because they have those barriers to entry. But they could also be breaking even in the long run too. That's also a situation they could find themselves in. So just because you're a monopolist doesn't guarantee you positive profit. But if you have these barriers to entry, it gives you the chance to hang on to your positive profit in the long run. Well, with our total graph, we're still going to have our normal total cost curves. The total revenue curve that corresponds with the downward sloping demand curve is a parabola. When total revenue is highest, your demand is at unitary, but that is also where your MR is 0. And that makes sense because if marginal is the slope of total, when marginal revenue is 0, total revenue is highest. So that can help you find revenue maximizing. We know how to find profit maximizing on a graph. That's where MR hits MC. But if you're looking for revenue maximizing, you can look for either where your demand is unitary or for where your MR is 0. On a total graph, if you're looking for revenue maximizing output level, obviously you're just going to look where your total revenue curve is at the highest point. But how do we find profit maximizing on this total graph? We're going to look for where the gap is the biggest between TR and TC. That gap is going to be the biggest a little to the left of revenue maximizing. Profit maximizing is always going to be at a lower quantity than revenue maximizing. Finally, one last thing I want to talk about with monopolies is something called price discrimination. You've probably experienced price discrimination in your life and you've probably benefited from it. Price discrimination is when a business charges different prices to different groups of people for the exact same product. Have you ever been to the movies and noticed how when you go to buy your tickets, there are different prices for different groups of people? But once you buy your ticket, isn't everybody sitting in the same theater, like watching the same screen? So that is an example of price discrimination. To price discriminate, there are 3 requirements. First off, you need to be able to set your own price in the first place. You need to be a price maker. You need to have market power, which means that on your graph, you're going to have a downward sloping demand curve. Remember, a downward sloping demand curve means that you can set your own price. And if you're going to set different prices for different groups, you need to be able to set your own price in the first place. Second, if you're going to charge different prices to different groups of people, then you need to have some way to separate your customers into different groups of people. This could be based on age, or this could be based on their elasticity of demand. Think about airline tickets. If you want to go on a trip and you need to buy tickets for a flight, do you want to buy those tickets well in advance, or do you want to buy those tickets like the week before? Probably well in advance. Why do those prices get so much more expensive the closer you get to your flight date? Airlines know that if you're buying that ticket so close to the flight date, then that probably means that your demand is inelastic. If you really need to be on that flight, your demand is inelastic because you would be more willing to tolerate a higher price since that flight is more of a necessity for you. If you're trying to book this flight and it's still 3 to 4 months out, you still have time to look at these prices and react and choose a different airline. So they don't charge a high price to the people whose demand is more elastic because those people can have a strong response and say, oh well, I'll just go buy it from somewhere else. The third requirement is you want to prevent something called arbitrage. Arbitrage is whenever people go behind the business's back and they can kind of resell this product and sort of subvert the price discrimination. So it's really reselling the product in a different market. Ticket scalpers do this, but let's say you have a friend who works at a store. They may be able to help you out and hook you up with an employee discount. Well, you're not an employee. So why are you getting the employee discount? That's a type of arbitrage. The less arbitrage there is, the stronger your price discrimination. Now that's a lot of information about monopolies off the bat, but we can fly through this a little bit faster because you already understand key concepts like the shutdown rule, the profit maximization rule, and how to read the graphs. Alrighty guys, until next time, see you later.